everyone, welcome and thank you for coming back to Listening In, the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society podcast. In this series, we want to give you the opportunity to listen in to some of the conversations that we are lucky enough to have every day. That is, with a variety of people and organisations all working in the field of mental health and well-being. Please be aware, this episode explores the topic of childhood violence and sexual abuse. Today, it's our pleasure and honour to be joined by Iain Peters, a powerful and emotional voice on the subject of childhood abuse, which comes from his own lived experience. Any therapist understands the quiet sense of privilege and humility we feel when sat in the presence of someone disclosing painful traumas and distressing stories. And sitting with Iain on a hot May afternoon, albeit in a non-therapeutic environment, felt no different. His ability to convey what happened to him as a young child and how it impacted the rest of his life is both deeply moving, while also ultimately inspiring and hopeful. An experienced climber, Iain eventually disclosed what happened to him and sought support in his early 60s. And after the life-changing counselling he received, Iain is now able to reflect on what happened and to separate the person he became from the person he was born to be, full of curiosity, freedom, and a sense of adventure. I'm not ashamed to say that when recording these podcasts, I still wrestle a little with the inner counsellor inside me. These conversations are not counselling sessions, and yet after so many years as a practitioner, that's where my brain still wants to take me. And so I do continue to struggle to find the balance of engaging, intimate conversation, but conversation that isn't therapy. And all I can say is I very much hope that for this episode in particular, both Iain and any of you listening in feel that I was able to do him and the story he tells the justice it deserves. So, first of all, how are you today, other than hot?
Good, actually, very good. Yeah,
Because you've had a busy week, I think, haven't
I
you?
know. I've been up north in Derbyshire. Yeah.
Amazing. Iain, it always seems like whenever we message each other or chat, I think I'm quite envious of the energy you have. I have to say, if I could have a few ounces of whatever you've got, I could probably do with that.
Oh, you probably wouldn't. I had one of the reasons I was up there was to speak at a international conference of mountain doctors, 300 of them.
Amazing. Gosh.
So, yeah, and I was the token patient, if you like. So
I
I
understand.
just talk about mental well-being and all those sort of things. Which,
And
it was good, but quite daunting.
yeah. And actually that provides us with such a great in, doesn't it, to open in a conversation, because you've mentioned there two really important things in your life. That's mountaineering and climbing and obviously mental health. And for some context as we sort of start our conversation,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I just want to let people know. So you and I very first met in Bristol at an event that was hosted by NAPAC, who many of our listeners will know of, and also Enable Law, who you've just mentioned yourself, who I know do a lot of work to support NAPAC in terms of supporting survivors of childhood abuse. And the book launch that I attended was for your book that you had written because you sadly find yourself as one of those people that's needed that support from both Enable Law and NAPAC. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
So that's perhaps helping people understand some of the places our conversation's going to go today. But I think what might be really lovely, in particular because I think it's important, what's happened to us doesn't define us. And one thing that really struck me at your book launch is just what a massive life you've had, aside from what's happened to you, which we'll obviously come on to talk about. So would it be okay, Iain, to ask you just a very sort of broad, open question in terms of, if I was to ask, who are you? And, what's your lovely long life? What stands out to you in terms of the things you've actually done and achieved? What would you say? How would you help people understand a little bit about you?
Well, I suppose if I was going to introduce myself, what I would say, first of all, is I was born into a middle class military family just after the war, at a time when everyone was thinking this was the war to end all wars, and we were in for a life for all of us would be peaceful, without any problems. I think Macmillan, one of the prime ministers at the time, said, "You've never had it so good." And certainly in my early years, that was the case. I was followed, my family and I went to follow my father to Africa, where I went wild in the bush of Africa.
Really? How long were you there for?
Well, only 2 years. They packed me off to school at the age of 9, a boarding school in England, which is where obviously I experienced some terrible things, which we'll go into at a later stage. What happened to me there then had a profound influence on the rest of my life. Literally the rest of my life, through my teenage, through adolescence, through growing up, careers, marriages, and all the rest of it, which is basically what the book chronicles, that life that I led up to, during, and after the abuse.
That really stood out to me at the launch of your book when you were telling a little bit of your story. In terms of, I always remember you saying something along the lines of all the decisions that you felt you'd made, or many, perhaps I should say, of the decisions that you felt you'd made in your life.
Mm.
You were able, once you started to process and confront what had happened to you at the boarding school, you were able to realise that many of those choices and decisions had been influenced by what had happened to you there. And again, I'm sure we will come on to that at some point. But I remember being in the audience and that being a really profound thing to hear from you, recognising just the direction your life had taken and how much it had been influenced by what had happened. But just to come back to Africa, would it be fair to say, Iain, that you're talking about running wild? It's interesting. Do you think that was the beginnings of your love of the outdoors, your love of climbing and of mountaineering, perhaps?
I mean, it's possibly, we all have certain aspects of our DNA, don't we? So is it nature or nurture? And for me, I think that essence of wildness, I got that through, I think my mother was, from what I remember, she's told me before she was born, I mean, she was pretty wild. And my grandfather, who was a retired naval officer and been through 2 world wars, very disciplined, but also had a wild streak. And therefore I inherited that, and I was encouraged right the way through my early life to do these crazy things, like picking up poisonous snakes and all that sort of business.
Goodness me.
all of which, I have to say, probably laid the, if you like, the foundations for the way that I led my later life after abuse and all the rest of it. In other words, a sort of inherent survival. I had quite a strong sense of natural sense, subliminal sense of survival. I must have done, I think.
That's interesting. And you talking about picking up fearless snakes. I hear in that almost a fearlessness, and I know that much of your life has been, again, dictated by fear. So to hear of that child with this, inherent fearlessness within him, again, tells us more about perhaps who you really are rather than who you became as a result of what happened to you.
Yes. I think that's very true. I mean, we, all of us, aren't we? We're all such complex creatures. And sometimes, well, what I found particularly interesting, if you like, in writing the book was the objectivity as well as the subjectivity. Both were very evident in the way that I wrote. So, in other words, on one level, I could be objective, look at this little boy or this teenager or this man doing all these things. And at the other end of it, realizing that a lot of what I did was very subjective and in some ways trying to survive.
Yeah. That survival instinct, maybe perhaps you can help us understand what you see that as, how that it can be different for all of us. We all find our own ways, don't we, of surviving. So you describe this childhood in Africa, but it got to the point where your parents decided that what they felt would be best for you would be to send you to boarding school, and that involved coming back to England, and you found yourself at the school in question, which we've obviously already alluded to. Just briefly, before we talk about what happened to you there, would you mind if I just ask a little bit about that transition from Africa to England? Do you remember anything about that?
Oh, yeah, very, very, particularly going to a boarding school after leading the life that I had led, both in Africa and to a certain extent, because I came home to stay with my grandparents who lived on the edge of Dartmoor. So once again, I was able to, ride or run across Dartmoor whenever I felt like it. But to suddenly find myself in a very enclosed place with very, very strong discipline, I found that extremely difficult.
I can imagine.
Because I realize now, and I have, and it's come to me through all sorts of things through my life. I am essentially a rebel. So if somebody tells me not to do something, that to me is a red rag to a bull to actually go and do it, and that can lead into all sorts of complications at times. But to go back to this 9-year-old boy suddenly finding himself in this environment that he didn't understand, had never really experienced, was a big shock to the system, even before the physical and sexual violence that was to follow.
Yeah, goodness, Iain, that's you paint a picture there. Again, even when you start to talk about Dartmoor, of running wild, and again, whether that's Africa or Dartmoor, open spaces, freedom, all these words come to my mind as I'm listening to you talk. And and then for you to just very lightly describe in a few words the difference between that and living at a boarding school and the rules and the system that you are then in some way, gosh, does it sound too strong to say shackled to? I don't know, that sounds a very strong description, but I can imagine you as a boy perhaps very much did feel like that, felt restricted by that.
Yes, I think, one of the results of that introduction into that atmosphere was to turn me away from systems. And one of the problems I've had throughout my life is instinctively rejecting systems, and even when those are good systems that are there to support us as individuals, I still have an inherent fear of system, which I think, I got when I first went to that school, quite apart from all the other things that happened. There, back in those days, the sort of late 50s, early 60s, there was this, our society was based on the fact that we needed strong discipline, and caning and physical violence would turn us all into good citizens. Had the opposite effect on me. Yeah.
That's such a good point, and such a great reminder to people that didn't live through that time and that type of educational system and that type of approach towards children and behaviour. That's such another really good reminder, just adding some layers to where you found yourself at the age of 9 in this school with these systems, as you describe it, that are so different to what you'd experienced before, so opposite, so completely new to you. Yeah, so that's so helpful, Iain. Thank you so much already for just giving us this context around the child that you were at that point, and the things he's experiencing and the things he's feeling. And I suppose now we come to that time. I don't know or remember how far it was into your schooling when things started to happen to you.
Well, I mean, the first day at school, I climbed, this is in the book, I climbed a tree and I was beaten for it. And that was a wake-up call, because I'd always been a tree climber, in Africa and in my home on Dartmoor and things like that. I loved climbing trees, as the corridor is about climbing, and trees were the start of it for me. So when I saw a tree and I climbed it at school, which was a natural response for me, to be hauled down and taken to the headmaster's office and beaten with a cane was something that was beyond anything I'd ever experienced. So it was a shock.
Goodness. So not even somebody just having a quiet word and saying, we don't do that here, that's not permitted here, this might be why, like might happen again, we might experience more now in a school or an environment with children. And if you do that again, then there may be consequences. There were no warnings, there was nothing like that at all for you.
No warning whatsoever. No warning whatsoever. It was like a lightning bolt, literally. Of 1 minute I was at the top of a tree shouting at all the people below, because I was climbing a tree and it was fun. And the next minute I was in the headmaster's office, being beaten by a thin cane. So it was an extraordinary. But I'd like to emphasize that I wasn't alone in this. This was happening to a generation, and would go on until it now no longer happens. That what you are saying is, if somebody's doing something dangerous now, they are, generally speaking, it's explained to them, they're talked to, and all the rest of it. So there is some form of communication. There was none in my time.
I understand. Oh, I'm so sorry. It feels unbelievable to perhaps people now that haven't lived through that, that children were subject to that. And you mentioned earlier that there was sexual and physical violence that was handed out to you at that school. And there you are on your first day experiencing that physical violence.
And then the sexual abuse started within weeks of that. So I guess the difference between violence, physical violence that I experienced, and the sexual violence would be different. I'm not saying it wasn't powerful, but it was different because as a 9-year-old, you are not sexually aware.
Yeah.
And you are aware that something is wrong, that something is hurting, and we don't need to go into the details, but it confuses, whereas violence, physical violence, is agonizing. You know, that you have the scars of that, you carry them away when you've been beaten. The scars that you gain, or that I experienced from serial abuse and rape, let's mess around with other words. I was raped for over 4 years. Those scars are much deeper in the psyche. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I remember when we met that day in Bristol, and I know you've come to such a different place in your life now. And again, we'll come on to talking about the counselling, the therapy you received, and how much that has helped you get to where you are now. But Iain, I remember the emotion. I remember your emotion as you talked about what happened. And I remember the emotion in the room as people responded to that with compassion and empathy. And I say that to make it very clear that time-wise, distance-wise, you're a very long way from what happened. And emotionally and mentally, you've done a lot of processing around what's happened. But that doesn't mean to say that some residual emotion and connection with that time doesn't still live within you.
It doesn't. It never goes away. And learning how to. I think the key, and we'll come to counselling and all the other sort of aspects of my life since those days. I've come to the conclusion that it's never goes away.
Mm.
You know, people say, "Oh, well, you can have therapy and you'll be healed," and all the rest of it. Yes, you can be healed in one sense, but in another sense, you can't undo the past. You know,
Absolutely.
What happened to me and what is happening to millions of men, women, and children around us in this day and age is a damage that will live with them for the rest of their lives. And it's learning how to cope with that, which took me the best part of 60 years. And which I now, what I wish for all victims, if you like, and survivors, is that they can achieve peace of mind and happiness despite what's happened to them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And many of the people that are listening to this will be those people that are sat in rooms with those victim survivors and doing their utmost to support them to come to the best place they can for it. Like you say, it never will completely go away. We can't rewrite what's happened, can we?
No, we can't. And I think the other important thing that I've learned is that emotion, what happens to people like myself, has got to have a huge emotional effect.
Of course.
And when you sit on your emotions and don't let them out, that's when, deeper trouble can happen, mental trouble. And I know from my best friend, who was never able to deal with what he was abused like I was never able to deal with it. But now I'm able to stand up either or sit down in front of a counsellor or friends, or even in a room full of people listening to me speaking, and say, look, I could, in the next 5 minutes, you might even see me overcome with emotion. But that is incredibly important for both me and for everybody else, because that means we can let it out. It's not hurting us. We're dealing with it. So
Absolutely.
That to me is extremely important. Yeah.
It's like shining the light under the bed, isn't it? And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Instead of hiding away from it.
Yes, and sadly, my gender is one where it's a stiff upper lip, and men do not, find it more difficult to let go of their emotions. Than I mean, for instance, very simple. But my mother always used to proudly say, "Iain never cried," and I think that's a bit weird, you, as if it's some sort of some of an advantage, a superiority. I don't believe it is. I think it's actually, we need to cry.
Absolutely, we do. Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah.
No, so. Now you just mentioned a friend there. You mentioned a friend who said has really struggled to cope in the same way, to survive, to deal with what happened to him in the same way that you have. Do you mind me asking, Iain, was that a friend who was alongside you at your school that experienced?
Yes.
Okay.
The book is dedicated to Keith. He was my childhood friend. We were more like brothers than in our younger day. And Keith came from, he had a violent and abusive father, whereas I never did. My father, he made all sorts of mistakes later on in life, but in those early years, I always knew I was loved. Keith never knew that. He lived in fear, so that when we were subjected to the abuse, and the abuse was the same for both of us, in fact I witnessed it. I mean, can you imagine how awful that is? But I witnessed him being abused. He was not able to deal with it, and sadly he died 15 years ago in a special home for people with mental illness and things. So he never achieved the peace of mind, or led the life that I've led. And people have told me that it's those early years that are so important, and I'm sure counsellors and therapists would acknowledge that, if those first few years of your life are happy years and you are a child and loved, that gives you a strength that you carry through all sorts of different stages.
Yeah, it goes back to that when we talk about the fearlessness and the survival of the young boy, weren't we? And what you're talking about there is, I suppose, a resilience as well, isn't it, that comes from knowing that you are loved, regardless of sometimes, again, what happens to us, that resilience can perhaps, if we're lucky, carry us through better.
Yes, and in spite of, all kids are naughty, aren't they, by nature? I know, being, having brought up three of my own, I realise they're terrors at times. But and I must have been a nightmare for my mother, particularly. The things I got up to. But I can remember being told off. I remember being sort of the horror of some of the things that I did, but I never ever felt that I'd been abandoned until I went to school, and these other things happened to me. Yeah.
So you never felt being naughty made you unlovable?
No, it never occurred to me that I was unlovable. Being naughty was second nature, of course. I wouldn't dispute that. But and actually, you know, I mean, we might get onto my later life, but there were elements of my later life that are both sad but also naughty in the wider sense of the word, put it that way.
And we will absolutely come on to that.
Still are.
So if we go back to the boarding school briefly, Iain, you have been very careful, and I really appreciate that for your sake and for anybody else's sake, of you've been able to do two things so far. You've quite rightly said going into detail is neither appropriate nor necessary nor helpful. But what you've equally done is you've very clearly named what happened to you. You've given it the labels that we need to give.
Yes.
What else would you like to say about what happened? And I think maybe I'm purposely leaving that very, again, very open and very broad for you. I think perhaps part of where we might be able to take this is about how you coped at the time and what you felt able to do, if anything, at the time.
Yes. I think, you see, a lot of what I understand now about how I reacted and how I dealt with what was happening to me as a small child. And you have to remember that, you know, you're looking back at 50, 60 years. And it comes back very, very clearly. And one of the reasons I was able and have been able and still am able is that when you are with a counsellor who you trust, you can go into that place and feel safe.
Yeah.
And so I can now, you see, so,
It's okay. Take your time. Yeah.
you know, I remember those sessions very well, and the clarity of the experience, which on the one hand is very frightening because you're going back into a dark place, but you're safe. And that is very important.
I can see, we can hear how profound that feels to you. That it was as soon as you said the word safe that the emotion came, just how vital that was to you in that process.
That's the essence of it, I think. And of course, it is, when you start out on that road, it is a very rocky and bumpy road that you're frightened by. But, you know, if I was to say to my 13-year-old self, this is what's happened, but let it out, talk to somebody, that's what I would do now. Yeah.
Iain, so I asked the question about what else do you feel you would like to tell us about what happened and how you managed that. And your response was to go straight to remembering your counselling sessions. And please correct me if this is a misunderstanding on my part, but I wonder if you went to that place of your counselling sessions because that was the very first place that you really were able to talk about what happened. Is that right?
Yes, I think, I mean, the very first place I went was to the police when I reported the crime, you know.
And please tell people how old you were when that happened, because that feels very important.
When I went to the police station, I was in my 60s, late
Yeah.
60s.
Yeah.
The consequence of that, and it happened in a very sort of impetuous way, because that's me, was that I then was able to talk to my first wife, who sadly died soon afterwards. But so I was able to disclose to her, and then I was able to disclose to a long time, very close friend and climbing partner, who happened to be a GP, who then introduced me to the therapist who would be the biggest influence in me understanding what had happened to me and the effects. The book really, my story couldn't never have happened without those sessions with the counsellor. In fact, at one stage, I sort of said to her, we really ought to be writing this book together, with you doing a page and me doing a page of our sessions, and share. It would have been quite interesting exercise to have done that.
And I know those two people that you've just mentioned, your friend that was the GP and your counsellor, are still very present in your life, aren't they? They were both at that launch that I went to. They're supporting you. Yeah, yeah. But Iain, you were you were holding on to this trauma from the age of that happened to you between the ages of 9 and 13, and you continue to hold on to that for around 50 years more before you disclose that.
Yes, because I didn't understand what counselling does, and I think it's wonderful. What counselling does, it doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't, you don't get a sort of blueprint of life from counselling. What you get is a form of understanding of yourself and some techniques that can help you to understand. And I mean, one of the things that I realized was that a lot of my life was led under the influence of the 3Ds, which is denial, deceit, and disassociation, because those are three big factors. One in what you consider to be a survival strategy, which they are. If somebody says you were abused, you can say, no, I wasn't, because that helps you. Then you're not in that category. Or you can deny it deep in yourself. You can go into denial and pretend it didn't happen. Or you can get into situations later in life, into uncomfortable situations where you learn how to disassociate, because disassociation, during and in the immediate aftermath of being raped, you have to somehow or another disassociate, because if you didn't, who knows what would happen. So that becomes both a saving attitude, but also a very dangerous one that you carry on. And I think combining this ability to speak your truth finally in a caring professional environment. And I have to say, it's the professionalism of the counsellor that encourages that sort of, it encourages one to feel you can let go completely. I think that's what made me understand all those different aspects of my life, of 50 or 60 years of my life. And I could then go away and pinpoint, as I have done in the book, some of the areas where the 3Ds came into force in a big way. Yeah.
You describe that so brilliantly in terms of how these extraordinary, almost inbuilt coping mechanisms that we have, the 3Ds, for example, as you've described, how much they are there to help us survive, and yet they then become part of the problem very much itself, don't they? I sometimes talk to people about, a prison and a fortress, could appear very similar, but one is perhaps could be seen in a very negative way, holding you back, keeping you in, and the other is a very protective, structure there for us, the fortress versus the prison. And you're describing that so well. I suppose it then makes me want to answer the question, which I know we alluded to earlier, and that is, and you've just sort of referenced again, and that is, so what about those intervening years, Iain, as what I mean is between the abuse ending and your disclosure and your therapy beginning, and the police being informed, etc. What about those intervening years? How did that denial and dissociation, etc., how did that impact the way you were living your life?
Well, I mean, one of the things I've discovered about myself is how, our lives are black and white. We're full of contradictions, continuously. And for a survivor of rape, for a victim of sexual violence, those contradictions become even more emphasized. I think that, on the one hand, you can deny, and on the other hand, you're doing things that you think are essential. Whether it's in relationships or whether it's in activities. I mean, at times I've climbed very, very dangerously with a if you like, fearlessness. Almost, I haven't sort of gone out and said, well, I don't care if I fall off and I kill myself. It's not as simple as that. But there is that element always of, you are, as a victim, you are experiencing both the sort of depths and sometimes even the heights of, I don't mean of the experience itself, that is just a deep lasting experience, but I think what it leads you to do is to lead a very, very black and white life. And I think that's what I understand that I've done, the good and the bad and the silly and the sensible, all those sort of attitudes are emphasized as part of one's own, I suppose. You're always trying to survive. If that is the name of the game, you don't realize that's what you're doing, but it is happening. And which is why, I've been able to get to the point now in my life where I'm living, I'm very, very blessed. And I have children, grandchildren. I'm in a happy relationship. All those things are happening to me, despite all the times I've threatened to destroy both them and myself. Yeah, which again is all those contradictions, isn't it?
It sounds like you're describing it like a recklessness, perhaps, to your life. And what about, so you've talked about your climbing, which again, we know is so important to you, and perhaps at times you were doing that dangerously, although not consciously so. What about things like your profession, your career, your work, things, those sort of day-to-day things that come into life? You mentioned relationships as well. Are you able to recognize you were applying similar survival choices?
It's a good point, that, because it's very easy to lose that. And I think one of the biggest effects of something like domestic violence or rape is this fear of power because you are powerless. It doesn't matter whether you're somebody in your 50s or 60s or whether you're a small child like I was. The effect of these things, it may express itself through sexual violence or physical violence, but it is the misuse of power. And for me, that the downside of that was a lifelong fear of power, of success. And therefore, in terms of career or relationships, all those attitudes were, you push them to one side. So ambition, I was, luckily enough, I still am, I suppose, reasonably intelligent and articulate, but I would retreat from success in career. I would not be able to consummate, if you like, a proper relationship with my lovers or friends or any of those things. Funnily enough, I've talked to some of my dearest friends who I've climbed with and things, and they have also been able to say, well, there were times when we could have strangled you. Because of your attitudes and because of you would disappear. My father was known as the vanishing man, and to a certain extent, I vanished whenever the going got too hot for comfort and I couldn't deal with it emotionally. I would disassociate. In the same way that when I was being raped as a 9-year-old, I disappeared in my head, and everything else in my reality was the bush of Africa. That's where I was at my safest. So it was almost felt that, in a relationship, it was unsafe to have an adult type of relationship or to commit to a career and all those things.
It's the way it sort of contaminates all those different areas of our life, isn't it? Sometimes almost imperceptibly, sometimes very obviously, staining almost the relationships we have, the choices we make, just always sitting there underneath it somewhere, all pervasive.
The perpetrator very often goes away and leads a successful life, as in the case of my abuser, leaving the victim with all the shame and the guilt.
Absolutely.
There's no justice in that. And it's that sense of shame and guilt that really you need professional caring help from all sorts of different areas in order to actually experience the innocence of yourself. Because, that's the terrible thing about this particular crime, is that it leaves you, the innocent one, with all the guilt and the shame. And that's how knowing that now is knowing that I didn't need to, I was blameless, has made a huge difference. And having that told to me by people who understand these things has made a huge difference in my life.
And you've been very clear that part of that was therapy. It's really coming across what great friends you've had along the way. I don't know if it's appropriate to ask this, so please tell me if you'd rather us not touch on this, but I am just also wondering if it's okay, Iain, about you just mentioned the word justice, and you've told us that you went to the police. They were some of the first people you told. Do you mind me just briefly asking what happened with that? How was that process for you? And what impact that had?
It was huge. I mean, it was the first, remember, well, I I was at a crucial stage in my life. There I was in my 60s with my wife terminally ill, all sorts of other problems which didn't seem to be associated with what had happened to me as a 9-year-old. At least I didn't think so at the time. But I had written down what had happened. It had come out almost like automatic writing, and therefore, when I found myself literally almost automatically walking into a police station with a grubby piece of paper outlining what had happened to me. I came out after an hour of that feeling that somehow or another I had made a leap of faith, and it hadn't been, for the first time, it hadn't been, it hadn't led me into further problems, that I was believed by the police sergeant or inspector who I talked to, and just to be believed after a lifetime of deceit. And I say deceit, it's not that I've led a lifetime of lying, but there is an essential deceit about what had happened to me. And to be believed was the first step, I think, for me, by the police. That was the first step towards some sort of resolution and ultimately justice and peace of mind. Yeah.
I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased that after all that time, that was your experience. And funnily enough, we were just a very short while ago. In fact, it was the last podcast we released was talking to Olivia from NAPAC. And she talked about being believed a lot. She said it's the greatest currency we can give to somebody who's come through sexual abuse or violence, and that is just believe them. Just listen and believe what they're saying. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that's where therapy and where people like NAPAC and the police, where all the different agencies need to come together. And I include government in that. I include the legislators in that. That yes, justice has to be seen to be done, and we have a justice system that is guilty or not guilty, and that system has to run its course. But anybody who says and believes that they have experienced what I happened to me has to be acknowledged, because in that way they can then be believed, and in that way they can then contribute to the healing and the resolution that is needed, even if, let's face it, if the evidence is not strong enough for a conviction, for instance, then you have to, having counselling or having people believing you, and still supporting you, and all those other things makes a massive difference. I had to get my head round, because my abuser, right the way through the investigation, until about 2 weeks before Crown Court, said he was aimed to go not guilty. And so luckily my present wife, Ellen, was fantastic. She said, even if he is released on a point of law, which he could be, if something doesn't stack up, a jury can't convict. But what you're doing is the right thing to do. And I was doing it on the back of counselling. I'm doing it on the back of support from my family and friends. So it would have been difficult if it had gone to court and a not guilty verdict had been brought in. But I think I could have handled it with all the other things that were helping me to sustain.
And all those other things, they're slowly giving your power back, aren't they? From the belief, and then the support, and you being able to make those decisions about where you're going to take this next is all part of that process of getting your power back, isn't it?
Definitely. definitely part of that. And also, I feel very privileged now to have lived the life that I've lived. And I have lived, many aspects of my life have been very exciting. And I've done all sorts of wonderful things, which hopefully I would have done anyway. But where I'm at the moment is wanting to reinforce my support for others who have suffered as I did, whatever their gender, whatever their age, the color of their skin, you name it. It is so important that they find this, they deserve the solutions that they so desperately need. And whether that is counselling, whether that's the police, whether it's the legal profession, in fact, it's all those things. And they should be made available to everyone. Now, I find it extraordinary that, counselling, that when you think of how much money, literally money, could be saved by people being professionally counselled much earlier on in their lives, and instead of you could say, much of my life has cost the government, if you like, from the point of view of being successful as a businessman or in a job or something, the tax and all the rest of it. It's so short-sighted that we now don't provide, that we as a nation and as a culture don't support those of us who are suffering and continue to suffer. It should be just there. That's what should happen.
Iain, I couldn't agree more. I mean it. You're right. It's both unbelievable that isn't the case, and it's short-sighted, and it's shocking, and all of those words that you've used, and I mean, in it's important that I say thank you for being that advocate, not only for all the people that have been in a similar position to you, but for being an advocate of counsellors and counselling too, because I know, and you've been so clear today, just how fundamental a part of your process, I'm going to say the J word, your journey in all of this has come from. Is it okay to name your counsellor? Is that? Because I know you're so proud of the work you've done together.
Incredible. Yes, she's now retired, actually, sort of from active counselling. Sally Openshaw, I should say.
That's right.
Yeah. She was amazing, and we still communicate. None of the place where I'm sat at the moment, apart from on my sofa at home, I wouldn't is in greater part due to the work, and she calls it the work that we did together, and I now understand that counselling is a job. It's a two-way process that has to, and it's a unique process. It's not the same relationship as you have with a wife or a husband or a lover or a child or any of those things. It's outside, or even a policeman or a lawyer. It's a unique piece of work that, once you allow yourself to go into it, produces, hopefully, for certainly in my case, and I think for many, many other people, it produces the results. And when we do something, when we work, that's what we want to see, don't we? We want to see results. And I think it works for the counsellor, and it works for the if you like, the patient or whatever. So if I'm more than happy to go out into the world on the back of my book, because a book, it's a memoir. It's a story of 50 or 60 years of life. But to me, it's just a stepping stone of where I can contribute now, late in life, to working with people who are dealing with these issues, which, let's face it, is one of the stains of our culture and our society.
Yeah.
And if I can address in only a small way or help in any way, then, I'm more than happy to do it. And if the book is that sort of a stepping stone, then great.
And that's how we find ourselves here today, isn't it, Iain? Because, again, that really came across when I first met you. Your absolute commitment and determination now to use your experience to educate, inform, enlighten, create awareness around all manner of different aspects of this awful topic. And whenever we've messaged each other to arrange this conversation, or been in touch, you're always away somewhere, and it's always to do this work. And I can't tell you how proud I am that we are able to be part of that for you, and give you another platform where you can share your story and potentially help people, whether that is victim survivors, whether that is people like Sally doing the work with people like yourself who are trying to process that. Everybody needs to hear this. It's so important, and you have a knack of really helping people understand, again, how it threads its way throughout your life, sometimes seen, sometimes unseen, but it's always there alongside you. And yes, you said at the beginning of our conversation today, it never leaves, but actually the distance you are now able to create so that you can talk about it has been remarkable, Iain. It's remarkable what you're doing.
Well, I think, for me, what I've learned through all this is, and we touched upon it, my fear of power, of success, which basically defined my life. I mean, I did lots of things, and I went to lots of places, and I'm not complaining about that, and achieved so much, but I never had that sense of, well, I had the fear of power, and now I feel empowered. And that's a big turnaround in my life, that I can now sit down and talk about being powerful in the broadest sense of the word.
Yeah.
I don't aspire to be Prime Minister or President of America, thank goodness. But I do, when I sit down, like we did at that launch, or the other day I was at this conference of doctors, which on one hand was very scary, because 300 top doctors from around the world, and you had to talk to them. But on the other hand, I thought, isn't this bloody marvelous? That I have that freedom to go and do that. And then I went straight from there to be with the climbing side of gay pride, and there you have another area of our society which we are only now becoming, coming to terms with. And I was at a festival for the climbing aspect of gay pride. So there were a whole load of LGBTQ plus folk there, and it was absolutely amazing. For somebody who had confused what had happened to me with homosexuality, because of that seemed to be it, and therefore had been homophobic for half my life. That revelation that, well, through counselling again, that actually, it's people that we love, It's not their gender, it's not their sexual preferences or anything else. And so to see a bunch of all sorts of different people having a wonderful time in the Peak District countryside in the sunshine was just amazing. Yeah.
You just used a word a moment ago, and I thought, there we go, we've come full circle. You said you were talking about the conference with the doctors, and you said, isn't it lovely to have the freedom to do that? And I thought, there we go, you're back there again. You're back being free, making your own choices for yourself. And I mean, what a wonderful place to end on, I suppose. You know, we started with that young boy in Africa playing with poisonous snakes and running wild, and we come here to you now with a very different, perhaps, type of freedom, but freedom nonetheless. And I do have to say, Iain, because I know this is an audio podcast, people don't have the privilege of being sat in front of you like I am. And I have to say, you do it all with a twinkle in your eye. You just have that twinkle in your eye that sort of the light never goes out of your eyes. And that's so lovely to see.
Thanks for saying that. And the book has formed, and I hope, the book, obviously we've won a Mountaineering Literature Prize and all the rest of it, but I do want other people to, outside, my own circle of friends, to read the book, not as it's successful, but just to show that, you can achieve peace of mind despite whatever has gone on in your life. And, so I'm always saying to people, look, if you want to, it'd be great if you buy or you read the book, but it's not an easy read. It wasn't an easy life, but there is hope. There is always hope. There's always light. And there are always people around who can help you through some of the most darkest times of your life.
What a lovely message to send.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, it was great to talk.
Oh, I can't thank you enough. Not just for this conversation, but for everything you're doing, Iain, on this subject. And it would be so easy for you to go back running out into life and almost just saying, do you know what? I've done my bit. I've come through my process, and I'm just going to leave it all there, in the dust, leave it all behind me. But you're not. You're continuing to walk alongside that young boy, aren't you, at the end of the day?
Your colleagues and professionals, if there's any way that I can contribute and go anywhere, say anything, do anything, I'm absolutely, more than happy to do that, to talk to anybody, go anywhere, and talk as we have, and encourage people to, just to lead their lives and to achieve some sort of peace of mind, basically. Yeah.
And I should say, just as one final word, for people that are listening, it won't surprise anybody to hear when we write the description of the podcast on the host platform, we will put a link to where they can find your book too, so that if anybody does want to follow that through and read a little bit more, because an hour feels so restrictive. It feels like we've barely scratched the surface, but we do what we can, and I think you've done that brilliantly. But yes, we'll put that link in for people.
I think my family and friends all tell it's I'm like that. Do you remember the Duracell rabbit that you wound up and you set it going and it just goes on and on and on and on? I could do that. Yeah.
Thank you to Iain for talking to us today, and thank you for listening in. To learn more about Iain and his story, all of the links that you'll need, you'll find on the show notes below. This podcast is brought to you by the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, a professional home for counsellors, psychotherapists, and over 120 wellbeing organisations across the UK. Autonomy, diversity, creativity, and community are at the heart of what we do. We're creating a positive space for conversations with people who share common beliefs and goals, because together, our voice is louder. If you would like to know more about the NCPS, please visit www.ncps.com for more information. And please remember to follow and subscribe to this podcast so you're always part of the conversation.